That was the Treasurer Jim Chalmers delivering his fourth budget. Hello, I'm Sarah Ferguson and welcome to this special edition of 7:30. In a moment, the Treasurer will begin to make his way to the 7:30 studio for his first post-budget interview. And later, you'll hear from the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor for the opposition's response, including to the government's headline announcement, a tax cut for all Australians. This was the budget the Treasurer never planned to deliver until Cyclone Alfred delayed the Prime Minister's plan to send Australians to the polls. Now it becomes the final centrepiece before the 2025 cost of living election gets underway. Here's National Affairs correspondent Jane Norman bringing you the main elements of today's budget.
An economic blueprint with an eye to the electoral endgame.
Hello, Treasurer, hello.
Delivering his fourth budget on the eve of an election, Jim Chalmers saved one big sweetener.
Will these tax cuts win you the election?
This budget is obviously being delivered on the eve of an election, but it's driven by economics, not politics.
Labor will reduce the lowest tax rate from 16 to 15% from July next year and to 14% the year after. It means the average worker earning $79,000 will get a tax cut of $268 or around $5 a week in 2026, doubling to $536 or $10 a week in 2027. The cost to the budget, $17 billion over 5 years.
Can we actually afford it?
Yes, we can, and we're providing these tax cuts in the most responsible way that we can.
The government will also ensure 1 million Australians avoid the full Medicare levy by increasing the threshold at which it's paid. It comes on top of a suite of cost of living measures, lowering power bills through a $150 rebate, making medicines cheaper by capping the cost of PBS-listed medicines at $25, and increasing incentives paid to doctors to drive up bulk billing rates. $35 billion in new policies paid for by a $36 billion windfall, Treasury finding a bit of wriggle room in the budget.
On top of existing spending, Labor's back-to-back surpluses will become a decade of deficits. This year's deficit marginally better than forecast at $27.6 billion, rising rapidly next year before falling back to around $37 billion in 4 years' time. Including off-budget spending adds another $104 billion over the next 5 years. It's all driving up net debt. $556 billion this year, growing to $770 billion by 2028-29.
As the budget slides deep into the red,
keep smiling.
The government's focusing on the positives.
We've got the bottom line better in every single year than the bottom lines that we inherited when we came to these positions.
Even with income tax cuts, the budget bottom line is increasingly bolstered by the tax take from workers, particularly as once lucrative levies dwindle. Revenue from the tobacco excise has gone up in smoke as the cigarette black market explodes. Treasury wiping $6.9 billion from expected revenue over 5 years.
There is an issue when it comes to tobacco excise. There's a big hit in the budget.
If there's one word that sums up the budget, it's uncertainty. Whether it's the threat of US trade tariffs, a slowdown in the Chinese economy, or wars in Europe and the Middle East.
Despite these global shocks, Australia's economic growth is gaining momentum. GDP rising from 1.5% this year to 2.75% in 4 years' time. Aided by another round of power bill rebates, inflation's back to 2.5% within the Reserve Bank's target range and staying there. It means workers are forecast to get a real wage rise each year from here as wages growth outpaces the cost of living.
Wages for some could rise further, with Labor vowing to ban non-compete clauses, allowing workers to move more easily between jobs.
We are genuinely turning a corner in our economy. A story of Australian exceptionalism in the context of global economic uncertainty.
The Treasurer hoping his budget offerings are exceptional enough for voters to give Labor a second term.
Budget night is part spending and taxing announcements and part a story about where the economy is headed. Here's 7:30's political editor Laura Tingle with her analysis.
In next week's budget, we'll have a bit more to say.
We can talk about these things in almost exactly a week's time. I don't intend to announce any cost of living help that will be in the budget next week.
You'll see all of the decisions the government's made through our budget.
Politics is a game perpetually in flux. We are either assessing things that have happened or, it feels increasingly, waiting for something to happen or land, whether that's a policy announcement, a budget or an election date, before we can make a judgment. Budgets are a particular case in point. They are mostly reported in terms of what surprises they contain or whether they are enough. But they are also an opportunity to freeze time for a moment and assess where the economy has come from and where it is going to, as well as what the government might be doing for us individually. That's particularly important as we approach the end of the parliamentary term and, as voters, are weighing up what the government of the day has achieved and whether it deserves our support. Or, as Opposition Leader Peter Dutton said a couple of weeks ago,
I just say to all Australians, look at what a government or a political party does, not what they say they will do.
if we look at what the government has done, Treasurer Jim Chalmers has framed his fourth budget as a report card on the first term of the Albanese government, comparing the government's record on spending, tax and economic growth against the so-called pre-election economic and fiscal outlook from 2022, which set out for all sides of politics where the economy and budget were up to at that time. Times, of course, were still grim then. The economy was just coming out of a pandemic. There is a much more confident tone to the Treasurer's language and the budget forecasts than we have seen in some time. The lurking fear that a recession is not far away has disappeared.
We've got inflation down, wages and incomes are up, unemployment is low, we've got the debt down, interest rates have started to be cut, and now growth is rebounding solidly as well.
All this is true. For the first time in the post-war era, we have avoided a recession after a significant inflation shock. Most people kept their jobs. Credit for that might go largely to the Reserve Bank, but the criticisms of the government that it should have cut spending more to help get inflation down faster now have to be judged against the fact that inflation has fallen and the private sector is set to take over from the public sector as the driver of growth. In dollar terms, that means growth in the economy is forecast to add $36.4 billion to the budget, which will in turn fund $34.8 billion of policy decisions outlined tonight. That is, the government strategy has worked. The Treasurer tonight argued that the budget was $207 billion better off than it was when Labor came to office, and that about half of that was due to spending cuts, or at least restraint. Things have been really difficult for millions of Australians. The $17 billion tax cuts announced in the budget, which had not been expected, will give angry voters, particularly those who have been disillusioned and disengaged, a reason to at least pay a little more attention. And once the government has their attention, it can point to the other cost of living measures it has been rolling out, including energy relief, Medicare bulk billing, and cutting pharmaceutical prices. And once again, it can point out the Coalition's past opposition to many of those measures. The forecasts suggest, if not sunlit uplands, a slightly kinder economy in the next year or two, in which people will enjoy lower interest rates, more disposable income, and a faster growing economy as the rate of annual growth lifts from 1.5 to 2.5%. Judged against what they said they would do, the government scores pretty well in this budget. As to the question of what it should do, that is, be more ambitious, reform more, the tax cuts will at the margin appease calls for tax reform for the time being. The budget gives the government an alibi for most issues going into the election campaign, which will make the Coalition's critiques of its strategy look somewhat pallid. The opposition has to make some quick decisions about whether it has any choice but to match what the government does. One issue that will remain contentious is migration. The budget papers are forecasting a net overseas migration number of 225,000 by 2027. Last week, the figure for the year to September was released. It was 380,000. And Treasury admits that number was not taken into account in its new forecast. Higher migration is already a target of the Coalition, and this forecast is likely to be an easy point of attack as it considers how it responds to this budget and tells us what it says it will do.
There are two overarching narratives in the Treasurer's presentation today. One is about Australia's economy turning a corner, The other is the threats to the economy from the global disorder. They both exist within the urgent demands of a federal election. The Treasurer joins me now. Welcome, Treasurer, and
Thanks
congratulations on your highly unusual fourth budget.
I appreciate it, Sarah, thanks.
Now, budgets, as we know, are about choices. You've chosen to give every Australian worker a tax cut, spending $17 billion, as we've heard. Why are you giving a tax cut to you and to me?
Well, this is about topping up a tax cut for every Australian taxpayer, in addition to the tax cuts which are already rolling out from July last year. And so we know that they're modest in isolation, but we think meaningful in combination with all of the tax cuts that we've provided and the other cost of living help that we are rolling out. Now, when it comes to the design of the tax cuts, in order to give a tax cut for every Australian taxpayer, the benefits are felt disproportionately to people we are encouraging into work. Younger workers, women, people on lower and middle incomes, they will proportionately be the biggest beneficiaries of these topped-up tax cuts, in addition to the tax cuts already rolling out.
Topped-up tax cuts, but they're still political. Have you stolen Peter Dutton's thunder here?
Well, I see these tax cuts in economic terms, and it's partly in recognition that even as we make this really quite remarkable progress together as Australians in the fight against inflation, we know that people are still under pressure. And so we're providing cost of living relief. Really one of the defining features of this budget is the cost of living relief that we're providing. Often the best way to do that is through the tax system. So we see it in terms of cost of living. We see it in terms of the economic benefits to participation. We found room in a pretty tight budget to provide these tax cuts. The politics will take care of themselves.
Are they fiscally responsible, though, in the environment we have?
Yes, they are. And you know, there's an appetite, obviously, and an enthusiasm often to provide bigger tax cuts. We have to provide the tax cuts we think the budget can afford, and we have to do that in the most responsible way. And that's what's guided us here, to give as much cost of living help as we can in the most responsible way, conscious of the pressures on the budget and also the pressures coming at us from around the world.
So put another way, the political advantage of the tax cuts, whether you want to engage with that or not, outweighs the impact on the budget.
Well, I think that's for others to determine. You know, I genuinely
believe... I'm here asking you.
Well, I genuinely believe that if you get the big economic decisions right, and we have overwhelmingly done that in the course of the last 3 years, I genuinely believe the politics will take care of themselves. Obviously, I'm not oblivious to the fact that this budget, this fourth budget, a very rare and cherished opportunity, is being delivered on the eve of an election, and it will set up a choice between Labor helping with the cost of living and Peter Dutton, whose secret cuts will make Australians worse off. Just
a question, have you ruled out an inflationary impact of these tax cuts that the RBA would be looking at?
Well, a couple of things about that. I mean, first of all, obviously, I briefed the Reserve Bank Governor on the budget. I do that for every budget and every budget update. I've done that for the last two Reserve Bank Governors, and I'll do that for as long as I'm in this job. I think it's important, so I've done that. Secondly, one of the most encouraging things about this budget is that Treasury's actually brought forward its expectations for when inflation gets sustainably in the target band. And so we've provided this cost of living relief in a responsible way, consistent with inflation lower and earlier, which is one of our key economic objectives.
But what about that specific question around whether or not there is an inflationary impact of these new tax cuts?
Well, we don't believe there is, for a couple of reasons. One, the timing. Secondly, there's a participation effect here. We're encouraging more people into the workforce, which is, one of our key objectives. But thirdly, we think we've got the magnitude right to provide some topped-up tax relief to every Australian taxpayer, but in the most responsible way we can. Now,
it is, as we are saying, of course, a pre-election measure that sits alongside the, I think, around $35 billion in pre-election announcements that you've made since January. How are you going to pay for all of those promises with these tax cuts now sitting on top?
Well, first of all, a large number of those commitments that we've announced over the course of the last few months were already provisioned for in the mid-year budget update. And
some were, not all, yeah.
Well, most of them were before tonight. The big mover, obviously, tonight has been the tax cuts. So if you think about the net policy decisions in the budget, about $35 billion, that is less than what our predecessors committed in their election budget, point number one. Point number two, half of that is the tax cuts, $17 billion in tax cuts. And point number three is $8 billion of that $35 billion was already in the MyEFO.
Now, you were fortunate in your previous budgets with record windfalls, obviously, especially from the mining exports. enabling you to post surpluses. So is what we are seeing now the true picture of your economic management with its unending long-term deficits?
Well, first of all, it's a popular misconception that the recovery in the budget was driven entirely by commodity prices.
I said largely, also tax receipts, but largely by very large...
Commodity prices played a welcome and significant role, as did the strength in the labour market. One of the things we should be proudest of as Australians is that we've got inflation down without seeing a spike in unemployment, and that's had benefits for the budget as well. We've been clear about that. But what matters is when you get those revenue upgrades, what you do with them. And we unusually banked most of those revenue upgrades, without which there wouldn't have been a surplus or a second surplus for the first time in almost 2 decades. Our predecessors spent most of those upgrades. We banked most of them, and that's why we had 2 surpluses.
I think what we're talking about now are the deficits into the future, not what your predecessors did. Let me put it to you in a different way. So over the term of this government, you've overseen the largest spending as a share of the economy since the mid-1980s, outside of crisis, of course. Who is going to pay for all of those commitments into the future?
Well, first of all, during COVID, for understandable reasons, spending as a share of the economy was about 1/3 of the economy. We got it all the way down below 1/4 of the economy, and it's settling a little bit higher than that, largely because of our responsibilities in the care economy and some of those unavoidable investments that we're making as a government. So spending as a share of the economy is settling around the kind of 26s. It was up in the 31s, it got down to the 24s, and now it's settling slightly higher than that. And in every budget, whether it's the $94 billion in savings that we've found, the way we've banked upward revisions to revenue, the way we've shown spending restraint when it comes to real spending growth being half the pace of the 30-year average, all of that comes together to make room for our commitments, whether it's strengthening Medicare, providing cost of living help, or investing in the future.
Should we just give the audience the numbers again for what's going to happen to the deficit? $42 billion next year, $35.7 the year after. It's $179.5 billion. We're not talking about banking surpluses. We're talking about what you're going to do to attack that structural position of the budget.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the budget position, cumulatively, is $207 billion stronger than when we came to office. Okay, and that shouldn't be lightly dismissed. That's actually the biggest positive turnaround in any budget in a single parliamentary term ever, in nominal terms. That's the first point. Very, very important point, often neglected. Secondly, this year's deficit is almost half as big as what it was when we came to office. Thirdly, if you look at the overall position, the bottom lines in this budget, it is stronger than what it was only a few months ago in the mid-year budget update. And so we're chipping away. And we're also making sure we make a structural difference to the budget in the NDIS, aged care and interest costs.
Yes, actually, let me just ask you about NDIS, because on that particular measure, as you said, it's been a huge pressure on the budget. Yeah. Can you confirm that it's going to hit its reduced target for growth of 8% next year?
Yeah, we're on track for that for sure. We're seeing some very encouraging progress. And the thing that we're encouraged by is that we've been able to get the cost of the NDIS to a more sustainable growth rate, still growing quite quickly, but more sustainably, while we still meet our responsibilities to people who need and deserve the scheme.
Now, there's one other measure that people are talking about today I want to ask you about briefly, and that is the extraordinary increase in the, drop in the tobacco excise. This is a situation where the tax has caused enormous profit to bikies and criminals, a failed policy. How do you fix it?
Well, there's 2 ways that we get tobacco excise down. One's a good way and one's a bad way. The good way is more people give up the darts. That's a good thing.
Yep.
The bad way is more people avoid the excise, and there is a problem. I think we've spoken about this maybe at this set on other occasions. So we're investing more money in enforcement and compliance because we recognise there's a problem here, and we need to collect more of this excise because we've got a problem in people avoiding it.
Let me just let's just talk about how the politics of the big decisions in tonight's budget are going to play out politically. Obviously, we are in the teeth of an election. I think the opposition has responded to your tax cuts. They're calling them a cruel tax hoax. Now, what does that tell you about how these tax cuts are going to be received? There's strong language coming out from the opposition straight away. Is that because you stole Peter Dutton's thunder, or are we looking at a tax hoax.
Well, that's the first I've heard of it. Sounds like they're not supporting our tax cuts, and that's what happened last time we tried to give every Australian taxpayer a tax cut. They didn't support that either. Peter Dutton was so angry about that, he said we should call an election to prevent those tax cuts flowing into the pockets of every Australian taxpayer.
Isn't he entitled to have a legitimate concern about you piling a tax cut on top of already a budget suffering from a structural deficit whose numbers are eye-watering?
No, we've done this in a very responsible way. We're providing tax relief to every Australian taxpayer. If he doesn't support that, he should say so. If he's got alternatives, if he's got alternatives, he should come clean. And they've had 3 years now, and they still haven't come up or come clean on any costed or credible or coherent economic policies. Angus Taylor's colleagues don't take him seriously. It is an absolute bin fire of incompetence and inconsistency. And what it means is, and as he told your colleague David Spears, Peter Dutton says there'll be hundreds of billions of dollars of cuts. They've got to find $600 billion to pay for nuclear reactors. They can't do that without coming after Medicare. That's why they're not coming clean on their cuts. And this week, they need to come clean on their cuts, because these secret cuts that Peter Dutton has in mind for Australians will make people worse off.
That's a slogan, and I think what the audience wants to understand is how you intend to put policies in place that change the dynamics of the economy that we've heard people talking about all week. That is, we are relying on tax revenue. Right now, you've given you and me $5 or $10 in our pockets, but going forward, who else is going to pay for all of these promises you've made if it's not the taxpayer?
Well, the reason I think that's an unusual question tonight, Sarah, is I've just laid out in lots of detail the government's economic plan to help people with the cost of living, strengthen Medicare and make ourselves more resilient in the face of all of this global economic uncertainty. And all we ask is that 3 years into a 3-year parliamentary term that the opposition does the same thing, to come clean on their cuts and how much worse people will be off as a consequence.
Now, I want to talk about the global uncertainty, because during the next 3-year term, if you get another term, if re-elected, you could face an inflationary global trade war with the US, ongoing demands over Ukraine, and a worsening security situation with China. With all of that uncertainty, would it have been more prudent to tighten the budget now to increase the capacity to respond to crisis?
Well, there is a dark shadow from all of this global economic uncertainty over the world's economy and over our own economy and our budget. We're very upfront about that in the budget papers and in my budget speech tonight. We do think that there is substantial risk that these escalating trade tensions mean more inflation and less growth around the world, and we wouldn't be immune from that, but we wouldn't be uniquely impacted.
How concerned
either.
are you personally about that, about the situation, about the impact on Australia? Very
concerned. And to go back to your original question, that's why it's so important that we have got the budget in much better condition. It's why it's so important that we're rebuilding incomes and wages and household budgets, and why it's so important that we're investing in a more resilient, more competitive economy. One of the things that's unusual about this budget, being on the eve of an election, is it still has economic reform, abolishing non-compete clauses, a national regime for the electrical trades, and it still has savings. And that's because we recognise the best insurance policy against all this global economic uncertainty is a more resilient economy, stronger incomes and wages for Australians, and a budget in much better nick. We've made progress on all three fronts tonight, but there's more work to do.
Where is the room? Where would the money come from if you were compelled, let's say, by circumstances to raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP?
Yeah, first of all, and I know you're asking a different thing, but first of all, we are dramatically increasing spending on defence, not as far as you just nominated, but it is a quite dramatic increase by historical standards, and we've made the room to do that. A combination of budget repair, and I mentioned the $200 billion improvement, and making room for our priorities. And in a tight budget, the fact that we've made room to help with the cost of living and strengthen Medicare and fund this increase in defence spending, all at the same time as we've got this year's deficit down, I think that augurs well for our ability to continue to make the right economic decisions for the right economic reasons, managing this global economic uncertainty, recognising that people are still under pressure, but more than recognising that, helping people who are doing it tough. When
you delivered your first budget, you said they were hard decisions for hard times, possibly harder times now. Are you going to be able to lay out to the Australian people in this election a plan that encompasses the future, not the situation, not the cost of living crisis you're dealing with now, but a genuine crisis in the Australian budget going forward? We've talked about tax, but a growing deficit up to $42 billion next year.
Yeah, I mean, it hits 42 and then it starts to trail away again. It gets back near balance towards the end of the medium term. But I accept the general proposition of your question. There are structural challenges in the budget. We've begun to address those. NDIS, aged care, interest costs, all of those are important ways that we're improving the structural position of the budget. But what I laid out tonight in the government's economic plan and in our fourth budget was a plan to help people in the here and now with the cost of living, but also a plan for the future. Investing in green metals, for example, investing in innovation, making sure that we are an indispensable part of the global net zero transformation. These are our aspirations for the future. We have taken an intergenerational approach to our economic plan, and I've laid that out tonight.
Jim Chalmers, thank you very much indeed, and congratulations, as I said at the beginning, on that very rare fourth budget.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. That's one political pitch, and in a moment we'll hear another from Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor, who will no doubt give us his views on the tax cuts. But what do the numbers tell us? Here's political reporter Tom Crowley to put it in context.
On the eve of an election, a chance to take stock. After one term, how has Labor changed the budget? Jim Chalmers says he's left things in better nick. And it's true that while the debt and deficits are still there, they're smaller. Still, he's had a bit of help. Factors outside the government's control have added hundreds of billions of dollars to the bottom line above what was forecast. That is quite a windfall. Early on, Labor said it was being responsible by only spending a fraction of that, but that discipline has slipped. And in this budget, most of the windfall has been used. In the end, Labor's own choices have taken the budget further into the red. But of course, inflation is a big part of this story. It's inflation that created these windfalls by driving up the tax take. And it's inflation that made Labor feel it had to spend to ease the cost of living with energy bill relief, rent assistance, health subsidies, and now tax cuts. It's the price tag of politics, and it's nothing new. Every government this century has made choices that have worsened the bottom line overall. But where does that leave the budget for the future? Labor inherited a budget with spending booming in several areas. Aged care, Medicare, defence, the NDIS and debt costs were all growing much faster than the economy. 3 years later, it's a mixed bag. Debt costs are growing slower. So are aged care and the NDIS, thanks to new laws. But Medicare, defence and childcare spending are accelerating, and every category is still growing fast. And on the tax side, we've seen only tax cuts. So we're still spending more money than we're raising. That means a structural deficit as far as the eye can see. And that story is unlikely to change whoever wins the election. The coalition has been saying it can do better than this, but we have almost no detail to back that up. And what we do know is that they're matching most of Labor's spends and adding a few of their own. We're about to find out if they'll match these tax cuts too.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton gives his full-blown reply to the budget on Thursday evening. Today, it's the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor's role to deliver the first response. As recently as the weekend, he made it clear he was waiting to see the government's numbers before the opposition could commit to its policies. He joins me now. Angus Taylor, welcome.
Good to be with you, Sarah.
Let's be clear on these tax cuts. Do you or don't you support them?
Well, this is a big spending, big taxing budget, which is for the next 5 weeks, not for the next 5 years. And what we see in it is a promise of 70 cents a day in a year's time, which is going to do nothing to restore Australian standard of living to where it was when Labor came to power. There are better structural, fundamental solutions to the cost of living crisis. That's not what's being offered by Labor, and so we won't support what they're doing here. You do not support the tax cuts? No. Well, look, let's be clear. They are a cruel hoax. I mean, they are not a genuine tax cut. 70 cents a day, 73 cents a day in a year's time, when for a typical Australian family with a mortgage, they're paying an extra $50,000 over and above what they expected. We need a pathway back to the standard of living that Australians had when Labor came to power. That's not what's being offered by this budget. We don't get there until the end of the decade, and that's simply not good enough. Let's be clear, because the Treasurer just now described them as top-up tax cuts that went along with the previous tax relief that the government has offered during this term. So should the tax cuts have gone
further? Is that what you wanted to see?
No, what we're
further
saying,
and sooner?
if you manage the economy, you don't see a collapse in people's standard of living.
So there's no requirement for tax cuts?
What we think is there is a better way to make sure we restore prosperity in this country, we get back to the standard of living that we had when we were last in power and ahead of it. And that's what Australians are used to. That's not what Labor's offering in this budget. We don't get back to the standard of living, as I said, that Australians had when Labor came to power until the end of the decade.
Let's be absolutely clear. The opposition will not be offering tax cuts as part of its budget and reply as part of its election campaign policies.
That's not what I said. I said we do not support what Labor is putting forward today. We have already announced important tax cuts. We've said that small businesses should be given accelerated depreciation.
Sure, but we're talking about a tax cut for every Australian. Just let's be absolutely clear. We're not talking about specific taxes related to...
Sarah, can I challenge you on this? When a small business makes an investment...
Sure. I'm not saying it's unimportant.
That raises the prosperity of all Australians over time. That's how you get productivity. That's how you make sure we're getting ahead. That's how you get a standard of living that's rising all the time.
I just wanted to get some clarity on personal income taxes. You're not in favour. You will not be offering personal income taxes as part of the election.
That's not what I said. I said we will not be supporting what Labor has proposed in this budget, and that's what we're responding to tonight.
All right, let's go to the budget more broadly. How long will it take you, precisely will it take you to bring this budget that you've seen today back to surplus?
Well, we'll make sure that the economy grows faster than spending. That's rule one, and the most important rule when we re-establish the fiscal guardrails that were thrown out by Labor.
I think your colleague
that ensures, Sarah,
within 10 years,
that over time you get back to budget balance. What we see in this budget, $170 billion of deficits, an extra $400 billion or so of spending and taxing since Labor came to power, and no pathway back to prosperity. Well, that's simply not good enough. So the fiscal rules that were in place, put in place by Peter Costello all those years ago, we'll re-establish. That makes sure and ensures that we've got an economy that grows faster than spending. And that way you can manage the economy, provide prosperity and help Australians to get ahead.
All right, but no time frame on that. But let me ask you another question. You said on Insiders this weekend with my colleague David Spears that you'd wait until you saw the budget to decide how many public servants you're going to sack. You've seen the budget. What are the numbers?
Well, it's gone up again. So we're now at 41,000 additional public servants.
Do you intend
we have said, well,
can
I just answer your question?
Yeah.
We have said we'll get back to where we were pre-Labor government when we were last in power. And of course that was 41,000 less. So that's what we're aiming to get back to. We've seen quite a substantial increase in the numbers tonight, and of course that is adding to the costs that all Australians are having to pay, and it's one of the reasons why we've got red ink as far as the eye can see in this budget.
So to be clear, you're saying that you're going to bring forward a policy that will result in 41,000
We'll be looking to get back to where we
jobs.
were when we were last in government.
You were also waiting to see headroom what headroom there was in the budget to determine how much the opposition can afford to spend on defence. What is the number?
Well, I'm not going to preempt announcements that are going to be made over the coming weeks,
including
in the budget
that
reply.
You would be able to do that?
Well, I didn't say I was going to on your program tonight, Sarah.
No, but you did on Sunday. So you've seen the budget now. What's the answer?
I didn't say I was going to do it on your program, and I'm not going to do it on your program. And I'll leave.
You said you needed to
I'll
see
leave
the
these
budget
announcements
to the
appropriate people at the appropriate time. What I will say, though, is that you will see us in the coming weeks focus on economic management, restoring our standard of living, delivering affordable, reliable energy, fixing housing supply, balancing that with immigration, and making sure that we keep Australians safe and secure in a world which is increasingly challenging. And you know, it's as uncertain a world as we have seen since World War II.
I'm short on time, but I want to ask you this. David Littleproud says that the Coalition will deliver cheaper gas prices within a year. Can you commit to the same thing?
We will absolutely be putting downward pressure on gas prices. I won't say more about that today, other than to say that they were lower when I was Energy Minister. And the reason they were lower is we made sure there was supply coming out of the ground and going into the Australian network. Australian gas, working for Australians. It's not complicated. This Labor government has absolutely failed to deliver that. And the problem with that is not only higher gas prices, but higher electricity prices, because the gas price plays such an important role in setting the electricity price.
Thank you, Angus Taylor, very much indeed for joining us and bringing us your first response to the government's new tax policy. Thank you.
Good to be with you.
And that's the programme for tonight. Our budget coverage continues with a special edition on Insiders with my colleague David Spears. Good night.